Welcome to the Robotics Through Science Fiction podcast. I'm Robin Murphy, and for Father's Day, I want to tell you a little about how my dad, Robert Heinlein, and science fiction changed my life. I fell in love with science fiction and became who I am because of science fiction and because of my father, and with a little help from Robert Heinlein. My father passed away in December at age 93, right before Christmas, after a long decline in hospice. He and I spent the time watching the Netflix reboot of Lost in Space and a lot of science fiction movies. I'm grateful he was able to see and understand that I had dedicated Robotics Through Science Fiction, Artificial Intelligence Explained Through 6 Classic Robot Short Stories to him. Dad was a World War II veteran, a mechanical engineer, and a rabid reader of pulp fiction, starting back in the 1940s with Astounding and Galaxy. We lived growing up in Mobile, Alabama, near Brooklyn Air Force Base, and the country was in the middle of the space race. Although he wasn't employed by the military, everybody in Mobile was obsessed with technology in the future. There was new math in the schools, huge military aircraft flying about the skies, and the Gemini and Apollo programs on TV. By age 8, I had declared I was going to be either a mechanical engineer, because you needed mechanical engineers to build space stations, or nuclear physicist, because space stations would, of course, use nuclear power. I was reading well above my level and was really tired of the Dick and Jane series from school. Not only were the stories boring, they were, well, just wrong. We lived in Alabama and my parents were in Georgia with a swath of nearly uninterrupted pine tree forest in between. And in those days, the pines were raised for sap to be collected in metal trays and boiled into turpentine. Later, the trees would be pulped for plywood and paper. But you couldn't miss the fact that pretty much every pine tree in the South had a metal cup catching sap dripping from slashes cut in the trunk. Now, this was a very different reality from the world of Dick and Jane. My classmates and I had been struggling with that whole concept of snow, which none of us had ever seen, but now the idea of maple syrup was just too much. I mean, tapping maple trees was a scenario that pushed the books beyond any credibility. I mean, we were so sorry for Dick and Jane being forced to make candy out of gross tree sap that was in no way sweet. Snow seemed interesting, but ultimately not worth it if you had to deal with that kind of candy. Anyway, the point is that I'd exhausted the supply of age-appropriate books at school. Mom kept taking me to the bookmobile to get more of the same, which was just increasing my frustration, and I was ready to read something more meaty. Here's where science fiction comes in. My dad was always reading those Ace science fiction double books, where one half was a book with a red rim cover, and the other half was a different book printed upside down with a blue rim cover, and they had titles like Alien from Arcturus, and the illustrations were invariably garish, with bad guys smirking through glass bubbles of their spacesuit helmets, or implausible alien monsters doing some sort of Godzilla rampage on some planet. My dad's books were stored in a set of cabinets in the lower part of the bookcase in our den before they got packed away into boxes when the cabinet got too full. I desperately wanted to read them. I saw my dad with a book with a wagon wheel space station on the cover and asked politely if I could read it when he was done. And I was told no, they were too adult for me. And that wasn't fair. Hadn't I just made a mock-up of a space station with those tubes from toilet paper rolls and lots of badly applied Scotch tape? Frankly, I had earned the right to read a book with a space station on the cover. This was the height of unreason, and I would simply have to take matters into my own hands. I was going to read those books. The problem was the cabinet was off limits. I was under no circumstances, let's repeat that, under no circumstances allowed to open the cabinet even just to look at the books and magazines, not even to touch them. I would catch glimpses of the piles when Dad opened the door and pulled out a new book, like the cabinet was some sort of portal and the books were an alternative reality. I wasn't sure what the punishment would be if I ever was caught, But the punishment was so bad it could not be articulated by my parents. But life could not continue as it was. I would simply have to risk whatever the punishment that could not be named was. I became vigilant, and eventually the opportunity presented itself. My parents were off gardening out of the line of sight. I still remember walking slowly over to the cabinet, willing myself not to lose my nerve, quietly opening the door as if it were booby-trapped. The mother lode yawned before me, stacks of pulp science fiction. In retrospect, could have ended awkwardly. The forbidden cabinet could have been a treasure trove of Playboys, but it wasn't. It was all science fiction. I think my father just simply wanted a place of his own. Anyway, I was overwhelmed with joy and indecision. I hadn't expected there to be so many books. How would I choose? I very carefully went through one stack looking for one that was a single book, not that ace doubles, because those double books were thicker and more conspicuous, so they'd be harder to hide in my room. There were a couple of regular books with space stations on the cover, so I've got one. I looked inside. Oops. The text was in a smaller font and much more dense than Dick and Jane. Maybe there'd been something to this too adult admonishment after all. But I'd gone too far to abandon my plan now. One of the books with a space station on the cover seemed to have larger chapter titles like the school readers, so maybe that one would be less difficult. Done. I had picked. It was Robert Heinlein's The Green Hills of Earth anthology. The chapters were separate short stories. And the very first short story was Delilah and the Space Rigger, about a space station under construction. Hot damn, talk about good picks. Clearly I had chosen well. In the story, the construction superintendent, nicknamed Tiny, has forbidden mixed male-female crews. What? And I had liked Tiny up until that moment. He had forbidden them because he doesn't want to deal with any distractions to the work schedule due to shipboard romances. After a crew member is injured or something, I forget that part, the Earth sends up a replacement from the operational crew that was scheduled to take over after the construction's complete. The surprise is that the replacement is Gloria Brooks McNye, most definitely a woman because the operational crew is mixed. She's an electrical engineer. What's an electrical engineer? Let's just assume it's just another name for a mechanical engineer. Gloria is more than totally qualified. She had trained a guy on Tiny's crew. Oh, and this is probably the most important part. She has a smart mouth and gets all the good lines as Tiny tries to convince her to go back to Earth or stay hidden. Tiny eventually says enough stupid things that he hears the illogic in his statements and realizes his only option as an intelligent creature with any self-respect, which Tiny is because at heart he is a good guy, he has to admit he's biased and consent to have mixed crews. He just insists that there be a chaplain in the next group who can perform marriages. At the end of that story, I no longer wanted to be a mechanical engineer. I wanted to be a mouthy, take-no-prisoners mechanical engineer. And Heinlein taught me that while guys might have problems with women being engineers in space, especially attractive women, well, that was the guy's problem, and real women keep going and don't put up with that crap. Later I would read Asimov. I liked the story Robbie because it reminded me of my mom and dad. My mom was always saying I needed to be more ladylike, while my dad was always taking me fishing. If I had been given Robbie the robot, my mom would have gotten rid of him, and my dad would have gotten him back for me too. It was just the way things were back in those Mad Men days. While I liked the stories with Dr. Susan Calvin because of the intellectual mysteries in debugging the robots, I didn't particularly relate to her. Donovan and Powell, Asimov's troubleshooting field repair techs, had more of that really sharp wit that I liked in Heinlein's stories. Susan Calvin was too drab and dull as a person for my taste. And later, 2001: A Space Odyssey confirmed my expectations that attractive women, well, at least Russian women, could wear shapely black dresses and be astronauts. But after seeing the Andromeda strain on a trip to Atlanta, my mom began the big push on me being ladylike, dating, and reminding me to include getting married in my plans. It was just after that whole space station had to be built first. In fairness to Mom, we watched the Andromeda Strain decades later, I was appalled at the stereotyping of a woman scientist, Dr. Ruth Levitt, as unpleasant, unattractive, alone, epileptic, and probably a lesbian. It wasn't an aspirational lifestyle or a great moment in STEM recruiting. But fortunately, I'd been inoculated by my dad's expectations of me and Robert Heinlein's stories, so it never occurred to me that the world saw Dr. Susan Calvin and Ruth Levitt as the norm, or that the world would see me in the diminished way that they saw Calvin and Levitt. These women weren't my role models, they were just rather cardboardish characters, just like the handsome rich men who turned out to be sniveling cowards. So it shouldn't be much of a surprise that I graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering from Georgia Tech back in the days when the ratio was 12-1 men to women, or that I worked in industry, married, and later went back to Georgia Tech and was the first person to get a PhD in robotics from Tech's newly formed College of Computing. I had 2 kids, and at the same time helped create the field of disaster response. I wasn't building space stations or even robots for space, but disaster robotics is harder than space robotics in so many ways, so I think it's close enough to fulfilling a childhood dream. Robotics is possibly the most male-dominated discipline of engineering, but like Gloria Brooks McKnight, I still get annoyed with blatant discrimination. Like her, it never occurred to me to change majors, change careers, or change research topics. After all, my dad and Robert Heinlein said I could be an engineer, and that's always been good enough for me. Remember to subscribe to our newsletter and YouTube channel so you won't miss a thing.